culture with worldviews which once would have been considered inconceivable but are now considered honorable, a small voice cries out in the wilderness. A voice which is unwilling to surrender to the demands or the madness of the woke culture. This voice may be small, and yet it holds great power. Power that cannot be weighed on the scales of a godless culture, but power that will nonetheless stand the test of time, because it is the truth. Welcome, pilgrims, to the Pugnacious Pilgrim Podcast. We are glad you are here with us today, and we are hopeful that you will walk away informed, enriched, and equipped to live as pilgrims in a brave new world.
Howdy.
How are we doing, Mike?
Doing well. How are you doing?
I'm doing good, dude. It's good to see you again. That's a nice hat.
Thank you. You have a nice hat on, too. It's the same hat.
Yeah, it is the same hat. And speaking of hats or shirts, since no one was saying anything about shirts, we just want to let you know our Pugnacious Pilgrim shirt is being pitched tonight. So for the fifth person to buy that shirt, you will get a shirt just like the four people before you. So we would say go ahead and buy it. If you want to find one, you can find it at our website, www.pugnaciousPilgrim.com. Mike, we got a cool show lined up tonight.
We do have a cool show. We have our own real live government issued man on the on the podcast. Why don't you say hello, Mr. G.I. Joe?
Hello all. I'm active duty military member. I'm one of the people that's waiting on a religious vaccine exemption, and I thought it would be interesting to get on here and talk about that, and also kind of religion in the armed forces in general, and whatever other shenanigans we get into tonight.
Yeah, and we are happy to have you. We're going to go ahead and call you G.I. Joe, I think. That'll be a way to protect your identity, but also give us something fun to say along the way. So thank you for joining us this evening. We appreciate it. And for our pilgrims that are tuning in, we are so happy to have you as well. And we would, like always, just say, hey, if you got questions, comments, frustrations, concerns, whatever the case may be, go ahead and weigh in on the chat. That's one of the reasons that we do this live each and every week, is that we love to interact with you. So today's show theme is called America's Patriotic Purge. And yeah, as a former military member myself, and having a person who's currently active duty living it, I'm sure that we have two very different experiences of what it means to be in the military. So yeah, I mean, what do you think, G.I. Joe?
Yeah, so first, unfortunately, I have to start off by just disclaiming a little bit, just that anything I say, all the views I express are going to be my own opinions, not said on behalf of any organization that I'm affiliated with. This is all my own thoughts, and I'll try not to make too many truth claims that I can't support well. But to kind of start off, I'll give a little bit about my background and ramble for just a second here. So when I went through basic training, there were about 20 or 25 people in my group that got COVID, and this would have been the first strain. I'm not sure if we're calling that alpha or what the actual correct denomination for that is, but a bunch of us got COVID. Had a test to show that I got COVID. Nobody had any lasting complications from it, which I think is worth noting, and I still am in contact with all of those guys. So this is, let's see, just over a year later, and nobody has had any lasting complications of any kind. So that's one interesting thing to note. And this is from supposedly one of the more virulent strains that we've had. But I'm a little bit frustrated for the position that I'm in, having to wait on this religious exemption, because I'm in a position where I've had COVID. It's on record with the military. They tested me. They called me to tell me when I was in isolation that I had COVID, and I'm still in a position where I'm being scrutinized and being made to wait to try to get a religious exemption, despite the fact that the antibodies are going through my blood right now. So I wanted to ask you too, Jason, when you went through the military, what was culture like around vaccines? Was it something that even got mentioned? Obviously, it's going to be different from right now, but I wanted to ask if it came up and what were your thoughts on it?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, for me personally, the only time I really ever had a say, I think, in what vaccines went into my body was right kind of towards the tail end of my time in the service. They were coming out with the anthrax vaccination, and a lot of that was tied into obviously what was going on in the Persian Gulf at the time, Iraq and Afghanistan, probably more specifically Iraq. And, we knew that we were pretty much the test dummies for this vaccine, and it had been rushed to delivery just as a way to protect the military, so to speak. But they wanted all of us to take it. In fact, it was a mandated vaccine, and I straight up just said, I'm not doing it. But I also knew that I was going to be getting out of the service in about 6 to 8 months. So I had, but up until that, I mean, I remember specifically in boot camp, just, getting kind of in processed, and they were shooting all kinds of stuff in our arm, and we had no idea even what it was. So I think the military kind of has a history of trying to just push people into submission, and I'm thankful to see some military members who are standing up for their rights, and certainly in praying and pulling for you.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been really interesting. Actually, one of my sergeants at basic training had received the anthrax vaccine. He'd been in long enough to have had it, and he and a lot of other people had some really negative effects from that. So it's an interesting point of comparison. Very different, but there's
Yeah.
still lessons to be learned there. So yeah, me and, thousands upon thousands now of other people are still kind of in limbo, just waiting. And I'm also in a fairly unique position because I completed my first leg of training for my job and was going to go to the next leg of training. When I was doing my out processing at the time, I knew that I couldn't PCS. I couldn't go to my final duty station after training, was the way the order's written now. But I didn't realize that because my next leg of training was attached to that I wasn't able to go to my next leg of training. So when I was out processing and went to get my orders, everybody was very confused. Nobody had told me anything. And I had to wait and hear back from my leadership, essentially, that I was being made to wait. And this was a really unfortunate situation for me because I had a whole lot of stress in the week planned after that for trying to get everything moved really quickly. The way they have it set up here, you can't have your household set for to have movers come pick your things up until they know if you're going to graduate your training. So I had a week where I was going to have to plan that out and had all of these things going on all at the same time. And nobody had told me up until that point that I wasn't going to be able to go.
Yeah.
Even my direct leadership didn't know until that happened. So right now, I'm finishing up my 2 weeks of quarantine, coming back from Christmas leave, and then I'm just kind of in limbo. I'm just kind of waiting here to hear back and getting weekly tests for COVID. Only the unvaccinated, which is worth noting.
Yeah, and I don't know. I mean, I guess kind of one question that pops in my mind around all this is, I as a person on the outside now, just trying to understand it, it seems like there's very, very few religious exemptions which have been granted by any branches of the service. Have you heard anything around that?
Yeah, I mean, there have been none granted as far as I'm aware as of, this stream, unless something just recently happened. So there's been some medical exemptions granted, which I find interesting, because there's been some amount of religious exemptions denied, but the majority have not been denied. So the majority of people are just waiting.
Gotcha. Okay.
What was I thought I saw something GI that that you had shared regarding there being now a database, like a government database of all of the federal employees that have requested an exemption.
Religious exemption, yeah.
Yeah. And that was shared in mainstream press. It's important to say because I know that'll be an easy a quick way that people would respond to something like that. But I honestly don't know that much about it. As far as I'm aware, the news broke just today or maybe yesterday.
Mhm.
But the fact that it exists and the fact that it's being reported even in mainstream media is concerning, to say the least,
Yeah.
because the organizations that those people and me belong to already know that. So what would be the advantage? What would the utility be?
Right. It's hard not to come to a conclusion that like it would be used for some sort of nefarious purpose. I mean, there's a history of the government compiling information like this and not necessarily using it for good,
True.
I suppose. So, um,
Yeah.
one question I
I'm
have
sorry,
for
go
you
ahead.
though is through all of this, and this is really more of a personal question, I guess, but I think it is important for people who listen to the podcast to understand how this might be hitting somebody on a personal level. Um, how is all of this putting stresses on like your family and your living situation and stuff like that? I mean, I can't imagine that it's making things easier than or any less stressful than they already were being separated from your family, going through training and all that jazz.
Yeah. So I'm in another unique situation there. So I entered the military relatively late in my life, in my late 20s. I was older than or the same age as a lot of the leadership. And so I expected to be going to this next leg of training, right? So I talked about that. And in that anticipation, when my family, separate from me, went back to visit their family, my in-laws, over Thanksgiving, we were like, well, we're expecting to leave soon. So rather than spend another, $1,500 or whatever on plane tickets to come back right around Thanksgiving, why don't you just stay there and then I'll be able to see you before I go to my next leg of training? Well, now I'm stuck here. So I'm separated from my family. And that wasn't exactly the military's fault, so to speak, but it was a decision that I made based on the information given to me by the military. So I am in that situation. And obviously, now I'm in a position where I joined later in life. I, you know, without a vaccine, it would be very difficult to find employment that's going to pay similarly, if you consider the benefits that I
Hmm.
receive now as
Hmm.
active duty. So and it's definitely something that is being mentioned. That's probably the most politically correct way to say that. When leadership has talked to the unvaccinated, you know, they they have made them aware of that fact, me included. And the financial aspect obviously plays into it. I mean, I joined the military because I lost my job from COVID originally. So now I'm kind of being put back in the same situation or maybe worse in some ways because I did this to take care of my family, but can I take care of my family if I'm going to compromise my religious beliefs to do so? And I say no. And that's why I'm in the position I'm in and trying to pursue the exemption. So to the more concise answer would be it is very stressful. But recently, and we've talked personally some about this too, but I do feel and believe and I'm confident in God's ability to provide for me regardless of the external financial stress that it may bring.
Yeah, and I think that's a very important place to be as a Christian, obviously. Like you said, we've talked about that in the past, but at the same time, uh these convictions, I believe, should be respected by the federal government. And in order to not get you to say anything that's going to get you in trouble, I'll just go ahead and say it. I think this whole thing seems like a way that the government can restructure from top to bottom, getting rid of all of the people who have sincere religious beliefs in order to replace them with people who are more likely to just follow orders and keep their mouths shut. That's what it seems like to me. I'm not, so full disclosure, I'm not a veteran. I've never served in the military, but being able to look at this from an objective side or from an objective viewpoint, if it even is possible, since I am also unvaccinated, it certainly seems like this is an intentional piece of the puzzle to try and get quote unquote patriotic and quote unquote religious people or conservative people kind of out of the military. What are your thoughts on that without getting yourself in trouble?
Yeah, there's kind of two aspects to it. So there's like the big picture, like big military, like not personally known to me, and then my experience, at the station that I'm at. So I will say that my leadership, um, they obviously feel different from me. There's not very many members of leadership that are unvaccinated, but they have been very respectful to me and the other people waiting on exemptions here continually, and it does not seem forced. And I've had to interact with them enough that it seems genuine. In fact, one of my leadership shared with me that in one of the first meetings that we had, he said, just for a frame of reference, I didn't get the vaccine myself until I was ordered to, because I didn't think, or I didn't want to, essentially. And he did end up getting the vaccine for what that's worth. But
Yeah.
in the personal interactions I've had with the people here that are responsible for aspects of kind of telling me what's going on or telling the other unvaccinated people what's going on, they have been genuinely nice and happy to provide information. They told us how we can do appeals and gave us very detailed information about that in the event that we are denied our exemptions. As far as the big picture intention, I think the optimist point of view would just be that it's kind of something that everybody else is doing federally.
Mm-hmm.
And in that regard, it's not being treated any differently from other federal employment, so to speak.
Yeah.
And obviously there's going to be differing viewpoints on, both the efficacy of the vaccine, but also the importance specifically in the role of the military. And it's also important to remember that a lot of the people making these decisions now are people that, just went through all this craziness with the pandemic, and that changed a lot of things drastically. Like my basic training experience was very abnormal because of COVID.
Sure.
And so there's people making these decisions now that are like, well, this was terrible. I'm being told that this is going to help. And they're not to say they even had a decision to make whether it was going to be enacted or not. I don't know who actually gets to make that decision. But in that aspect, I can understand how they can feel the way that they do regarding the, wanting everybody to be vaccinated. So I don't agree with it, but I can understand how they came to that conclusion and the mindset that someone would be in to make those decisions.
Yeah, and that's a great point. I mean, I think one thing, G.I. Joe, that we have to remember is that, the military must be always ready, right? And so they have to lean pretty heavily on the whole concept of operational readiness, which, when I was in, the comparison to anthrax, that was a big part of it, right? Is you can't afford to have a military that is out sick, and so I think back even to, the Revolutionary War, right? Like George Washington made the decision to inoculate his entire army against smallpox. At the time, the way that they did that is to expose them to smallpox, and knowing, I guess, that the issue was if they were to have an entire, infantry or whatever that, got this naturally or whatever, that they wouldn't have been ready to fight the battle. So I get it from that perspective. I guess for me personally, one thing that I always try and wrestle with, even with myself as an unvaccinated person, I've had my kids, so I think one of the biggest question marks is what was this going to do, to birth rates and even to children. And, we just don't know enough. And so it was tough to jump into that. But as these mandates kind of were coming from the top down and not, I guess having been a military person, I understood mandates from that perspective. But as I saw it, stretching the arm into all aspects of, just really weird, arbitrary ways, like companies with 100 people or more, it became less about the vaccination, at least for me personally, and more about, are we really free? You know what I mean?
Yeah, and that's kind of one of the parallels that we can draw between like the federal mandates for federal employees and for the private sector, is that a lot of these people that are having to now enforce, and the Supreme Court ruled today that a lot of the vaccine mandates are unconstitutional, except for in the healthcare field, and I think still for federal workers, it's mandated.
Yeah, this is private sector.
Yeah, the goofy part about it is that the people that are now put in charge of enforcing these, they may not even believe in the mandate. Mm-hmm. It's people that are way above them, which is why I think it's important that you said, GI, that the people that you're dealing with are being very reasonable. Mm-hmm. They're being very polite. They're being very kind, because I think a lot of those people, if it was up to them, they would be granting religious exemptions, which is going to cause a lot of turmoil when all these branches of the military and all these federal positions end up losing really, really good people that they didn't want to lose because people at the very top were making decisions.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's important to understand. If there's anybody else who's military or somebody who's trying to retire, who's trying to get the exemption, just remember the disconnect. I mean, I had to meet with the chaplain here. Chaplain was very respectful. He put through my exemption to the next level. I met with the commander, very respectful, put it through to the next level. And that, in the big military, so to speak, is kind of where everything's held up now. And it's frustrating because like we don't know who to be frustrated with.
Yeah.
And you can't really talk to anybody about it. I mean, you write a letter as part of the exemption process, and I'd like to think that I wrote a good one. And I just wish that I could have more of a conversation with somebody. And I've said this to you, Mike, before about the private sector more, but it's frustrating to know that in a lot of ways, the decisions about the sincerity of religious belief for these is being decided by people that don't have religious beliefs.
Yeah, and it's pretty arbitrary. The way that these things, at least in the private sector, have panned out is a bunch of sincerely religious people will send in their testimonials or their request for exemption into an HR department, and then the HR department compares all of the sincere, or they compare all the testimonials of all the believers in the company, and they'll say, hey, well, 90% of the Christians in our company went and got the vaccine, so what makes you different?
Yeah.
And then now they're comparing your sincere religious beliefs against somebody else's sincere religious beliefs and essentially trying to say that yours are not sincere enough.
Yeah. And I mean, I have no idea what their process is like once it gets to the point it's at now. Obviously, I think unless you're saying something really explicit, at least for the culture that I'm in locally now, like my chaplain who is vaccinated didn't say anything, didn't ask me, he tried to ask me questions to say like, elaborate on that because they're going to want to know. And like, he was very respectful when I was leaving. I had talked about, my children and kind of some decisions that were made as far as parenting, and just, we had this big conversation. When I was leaving, he said something to the effect of, it's good to see, somebody who is also a Christian who's decided to raise their kids that way, keep doing it, sort of thing. So
yeah.
And I mean, for me, kind of the bigger topic for us tonight isn't necessarily just around the idea of mandates. It's really this picture of, patriotism and kind of the understanding of what that even means, kind of being intentionally pushed out of the American culture as we know it, including at least in my summation, the military. I know as I was transitioning out of the military at that time, the chaplain's ability to do their job within the convictions of their own conscience and their biblical conviction or whatever it was, right? Like they could live faithfully and fully into that position without really the fear of, the PC police coming after them, if you will. But I remember, I got out in 2005, and I remember not that long after there was a chaplain that was removed from his position at the Naval Academy because at lunchtime he decided to pray in Jesus' name. And so I guess, for me personally, as I look at where we're at, where we were, and where I see us heading, it's kind of, this idea of America as we knew it, freedom of religion as we knew it, freedom of speech as we've known it, really freedom as we've known it, is drastically changing. And I can't help but wonder if that's all part of the point, maybe, like the point that Mike brought up earlier.
Yeah, and I mean, for example, it was reported for the court case going on between the Navy SEALs regarding their exemptions, that it's at least being alleged that they were told that they weren't going to be eligible for certain positions, and they weren't going to be deployable, they weren't going to be
promotable.
So, and thus far, factually speaking, for where that case is at, a judge did rule that that was not legal. So we'll see where that goes next. But I think that is something that's possible. Maybe a strategy, so to speak, that will be used is that maybe people will be allowed to have exemptions, but then they'll be kind of unable to advance in the same way as vaccinated people. I think that is very possible.
Yeah.
And
I mean, it's kind of happening in the private sector already. I know at my own company, I am no longer allowed in the office. I'm no longer allowed to meet with any other employees in person. I cannot be nominated for our president's club. Maybe I can be promoted. I don't know. But I certainly feel like I'm being discriminated against in all those other ways, So coworkers of mine that want to get together with me, it's like we have to keep it on the low, make sure we don't schedule any of those plans on work communication and stuff like that. So, I mean, just looking at the way this whole thing is panning out, I don't think it's wrong to assume that those are potential next steps.
yeah, I think that's reasonable.
Yeah, and I think, to the point that Mike brought up earlier, I'm just looking at the Washington Post article that hit the press last night, but it was talking about an obscure federal agency has proposed creating a database capturing the names of personal religious information of government employees who submit religious accommodation requests to be exempted from the administration's COVID-19 mandate. And so here it just goes on to say that at least 7 other federal agencies, including 5 cabinet departments, are apparently setting up similar personal religious information databases, according to an analyst at the Heritage Foundation. And so, one would have to question, and again, this isn't the first time in recent history, really, where we've run into an issue of the federal government misusing data that they have and information that they have at their ready to maybe attack those with a certain ideology or a certain worldview. I'm thinking specifically about the IRS and how they came down on, some of the Tea Party folks, probably a decade ago. I mean, we have a reason to be skeptical, and we have a reason to wonder what's really going on here.
Yeah, and I was actually going to bring up that story as soon as you mentioned it. So it's interesting that you do, but I guess my stance on it would be that I would expect there to be more lawsuits that come out of this and the whole thing to be a legal mess. And for my personal, somewhat selfish hope for right now is just that it doesn't drag out longer than it needs to. I'm not in a super uncomfortable position, I suppose, but And this is something that I included in my exemption request too, is like that I want to do the job that, I joined to do. And I'm not trying to get over on anybody or like sneak in and, like I'm just a guy that doesn't want to get vaccinated. I just want to do my job. And I think that that's the case for the majority of people. And it's, frustrating to be singled out for a belief that in my opinion doesn't meaningfully affect my actual job.
Right, and it doesn't meaningfully affect like a lot of things. I mean, if we want to talk about the vaccine just for what it is, right? We know that it doesn't prevent you from getting COVID, and we know that it doesn't prevent you from spreading COVID. But it looks like it probably does help attenuate some of the symptoms. However, it's not a guarantee that you won't have symptoms, and it's not a guarantee that you won't get sick or have to go to the hospital, and it's also not a guarantee that you won't die. So a guy like me looking at all this stuff, I'm like, what's the point of a mandate if it doesn't do what it has been advertised to do? I would certainly understand if it actually stopped the spread, but for me, it seems like this is all so blatantly like a power grab. To me, it seems like it's so blatantly just like, do what we tell you or else. That's just how I see it, at least.
There's been I haven't, again, so my perception has kind of those two levels, right? But on the local one, there's been a lot of, it's not encouragement, there's been no threats, there's been nothing like that. But anytime that there is a meeting that comes up, it's kind of said, you know you could get it today and not have to worry about it. And that's sort of the level that they're on. They're not really even trying to guilt us. At least, that's my perception socially, that they're not trying to guilt us, but they are saying like it would be so much easier if you just did.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, the pressure's on, right? I mean, and I think, what you've kind of expressed, at least to some degree, is that, even the leaders that you've spoke of who have decided to go ahead and get the vaccine against their better judgment, maybe, or at least their initial judgment, they kind of just said the same thing, right? Like, just toe the line, don't make waves. And I think in a lot of ways, that's how these kind of pressure campaigns actually work, is that, you can use things like, hey, I don't know how it was for you going through boot camp, but for me, my recruiter basically said, if you can get through boot camp without your drill sergeant knowing who you are, it's going to be a good 8 weeks, good 10 weeks. You just don't want to make yourself known, at least not for the wrong things, right? So, the pressure for me when I was in the service is that you wanted to make yourself known for the right things. You wanted to be, for me personally, I wanted to be known as a good sailor. I wanted to be known as a leader. I wanted to be known as someone who can take orders and then take initiative and do all these things, as a self-starter, and someone that they can trust, and someone that has integrity. You didn't want to be known for the bad things, right? And I think a lot of times that pressure maybe puts people in compromising situations where, they're maybe making decisions against their conscience or their better judgment, just based on that fact alone, that I don't want to make waves.
yeah, I think that's definitely true. And I guess another thing that's important for me to remember is that my situation is pretty different. I joined 10 years later than most of the people there. So you're going to feel much pressure if you're a younger person who's just, left home potentially
Sure.
for the first time to go kind of do what you're told. And I mean, a lot of people think they're legitimately doing the right thing, but there's a lot of people who did it because they felt like they had to, not
Yeah.
because they thought it was the right decision or moral or even useful. So
Yeah.
it's
Well, that's
frust-
happening in the private sector too, right? Like, my boss was essentially forced to get the vaccine against her will in order to keep her job. Well, not forced, right? But they basically, in order to keep her job. And then she just found out today she didn't actually have to do that according to federal law. I mean, can you imagine like how horrible she must feel right now? Like,
Yeah.
just what a mess.
Yeah, and I think too, the VIIRS data, as that continues to creep up too, where some of the adverse effects of the vaccine become, more prevalent and people become more aware of them as well.
Yeah, my boss had to take 2 days off.
Yeah.
When she got she got more sick from the vaccine than when she actually had gotten COVID, because she had already gotten COVID before.
Yeah. Yeah, so maybe that's a question that I'd personally like. I mean, just generically, I mean, as you look across the board at your fellow, service members, I mean, what is the COVID outlook, within the ranks? Does it compare pretty consistently to maybe what the rest of us are seeing?
What do you mean by the COVID outlook?
Yeah, I mean, as far as the outbreak. Maybe, I mean, are they doing a good job curbing COVID because of the high level of vaccination, or are you seeing a lot of breakthrough cases that are, wreaking havoc just like the rest of us are?
So my perception and my experience for where we're at is not so bad. Like there's not very many people getting COVID. There are people
Okay.
getting COVID, but it's also important to remember that, especially for where I'm at. So I'm at a training station. So it's almost entirely training. So basically everybody here except for the permanent party members are super young.
Okay.
Like I'm one of the oldest, junior enlisted here. So we're all relatively healthy. I mean, there's a couple of people who are like, wow, you need to eat a few less cheeseburgers. But the majority of people here, and they, for the most part, it's there's long training here, but they just got out of basic training for the most part, or not that long ago. So they're all pretty healthy. So I don't see that many COVID cases, but there's probably also a non-zero amount of people who get it and are asymptomatic. And because they never get tested, especially if they have a vaccine, they really never get tested if they're asymptomatic,
Yeah.
that we just don't know about. And that kind of ties into another point of frustration for me, that this isn't specific to the military, but the way that changing guidelines and regulations have occurred throughout the whole thing, both, for me personally where I'm at, but also federally. And I think that the fact that they keep changing has made even people who, strongly believe in the efficacy and importance of vaccines kind of be questioning, like, well, was it right before? Or if not,
Yeah.
then why?
Yeah.
Like 10 days, 5 days, like,
Yeah.
do you have to quarantine? You don't have to quarantine. And I mean, and now we're getting to the point where the unavailability of tests is becoming frustrating. And there's a ton of people, there have to be, who have had COVID, never been tested, and we don't know about it, and they're not added to case numbers.
Yeah, to any
And then
list,
that makes it, and then it makes it look worse for the
Yeah.
unvaccinated.
Well,
when it's
that
not.
yeah, that's even a justification I've seen for the high level of outbreak, like how the outbreak numbers are higher than they should be after everybody's getting vaccinated. And people who are pro-vaccine and stuff like that, they're like, oh, well, yeah, that's because everybody's out and about again. And it's like, but wait, I thought they were all out and about again because they were all vaccinated, and it's like, well, yeah, but the unvaccinated are going out too. And it's like, okay, well, who's giving them COVID? And why are there more people in the hospitals now than even before, even though, like, before we didn't have a vaccine, but we're being told it's all unvaccinated people in the hospitals. It's like, all you have to do is like put a couple things together and you're like, are we being lied to about the numbers? Like what? Like,
Yeah.
It just doesn't really make sense.
Well, and I know, the state of New York, or at least New York City, came out just today and this week, and clarified that, 75% of those who are in the hospital with COVID actually aren't there with, they weren't there for COVID. They were there for other things, and it was determined that they also had COVID, and it's just, I think like anything else, like numbers are only valuable if you have transparency behind them, right? So, I mean, just looking at the DoD, website, it looks like, as of this past November, which I know, takes out Omicron from the picture, really. There was less than 100,000 cases in the Army, 33,000 cases, almost 34,000 cases in the Marine Corps, 66,000 in the Navy, 56,000 in the Air Force, and the National Guard had 43,000 cases, and then other DoD agencies had roughly 2,000, and of all the military, there were 88 deaths from COVID, and we don't really know the comorbidities of those 88, right? But it's just like what issue are we really trying to solve here is maybe the case that I'm trying to make.
Yeah, well, I got into a discussion today with somebody about obviously COVID. But we were talking about basically how the hospitals are like overrun right now. And I was like, well, probably didn't help that a bunch of nurses got fired. And they were like, excuse me, it wasn't actually nurses exclusively that got fired. It was healthcare workers. And I was like, okay, well, I guess we'll play the semantics game. But then she linked to me a local healthcare union that had like, I want to say it was like 22,000 people in their union. And of the 22,000, like only 150 of them actually lost their jobs because they were unvaccinated, and 40 of them ended up getting vaccinated. So there's a statistic. And then she goes, right now they have 1,000 employees that are out sick with COVID. And I'm like, wait a second, aren't those all vaccinated people that are all out sick with COVID? I thought you were just telling me that the vaccine works.
The vaccine works, and the only reason those vaccinated people were out sick with COVID is because unvaccinated people came into the hospital.
Oh, man.
So, yeah, I mean, it's silly word games that I think, I'm on one hand, I'm super happy to hear that kind of in the real rank and file military, at least from your perspective, that you're seeing a lot more of the camaraderie and brotherhood that I experienced when I was in the military, and just people being respectful of one another, respecting their their conscience, respecting their convictions, and I love to hear that. I'm just really pulling that maybe with enough people a little bit higher up pushing back on some of the decision makers at the top, hopefully we don't lose a lot of good military in this mess.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's frustrating. Like my situation might be unique, but I get along well with my leadership. I'd like to think that I'm a pretty good example of a military member, and I don't have any disciplinary or legal problems or anything, and I did well in my training, and I graduated, and XYZ, and did well. But it's frustrating to know that they can't do anything.
Yeah,
and
their hands are tied.
Yeah, it's obviously not their fault, and I'm sure some of them are just being polite to be polite, and that's fine. I would like to believe that that's something that we can still do, is be polite to people that disagree with us, but it is an unfortunate situation that, like you mentioned, there's a lot of good people who want to do the job that they were hired to do and might not be able to. I mean, some amount of people have been already discharged, and what I'm hoping is the case for the people that were already discharged, and there's no way to know this one way or the other. I would hope that those are people that maybe were obviously not religious, like maybe even said something in their interviews or letters to that effect, or contradicted themselves or something. I would hope.
You mean kind of like maybe Donald Trump did? What's your favorite Bible verse? Well, really, all of them.
Yeah. Yeah, I would hope that it's some of that, and I'm sure some of that is happening. I will say, for the people that I know locally here at the station that I'm at, they, when we speak to each other, we're quoting Bible verses, we're saying all
Yeah.
these things, and it
Yep.
does appear to be a largely Christian pushback for the group that I have locally, at least. I remember, I can't remember what the context was, but somebody was talking about in our chat, saying something to the effect of, or showing a link saying, there's this vaccine that you could get instead, and somebody responded with, "Get behind me, Satan." So so my experience for where I'm at is that it appears strongly that the other people here do have real, legitimate religious convictions. Obviously, I do as well, and I included a whole lot of writing in my letter to that effect. And I hope that it does something. I hope that it can make a change, like you were saying. I hope that there is a way for people who want to do well at a job. I mean, I went through this training that I'm in is one of the hardest academically, most challenging in the enlisted military, and I I gave it a lot, and it took a lot,
Mm-hmm.
and I did it, you know, by choice, and I wanted to do the job. I was excited to do the job. I'm excited to have the new skills that it gave me, and I want to use them for the purpose that which they were given to me. And I just it would be much easier as a social person for me to be able to talk to the person that makes the decision, but it's frustrating that it's instead a letter. And not to say that I'm a bad writer, but it's just the
Yeah.
further removed it is from a person, the more stress it's going to cause because you don't know what's happening, especially with the length of time we've been waiting. I started the exemption process in September,
Man. Yeah.
and normally they're supposed to respond within 30 days, but they are allowed to not meet that requirement. And I forget exactly how the order's worded, but extreme circumstances, more or less. And this does qualify for that, but it
For
is
sure.
also very frustrating. If they were going to tell me that I was being denied, I would appeal. I'm going to appeal if they deny me, but I assume if they deny people, they're not going to accept any appeals. I just wish we could get to the point where they would at least tell me and everybody else,
How's it looking?
yeah, I wish they could just tell me.
Well, and you have to wonder too, maybe the fact that they're not, I mean, the longer it strings you along, the more pressure probably that comes from families and others that are like, hey, we can't just be left hanging, so let's just bite the bullet and get the shot. Take the Fauci ouchie and move on.
Yeah, and another side of that same issue is that unvaccinated people, at least, again, speaking personally and factually from my situation here, were offered the opportunity to voluntarily separate rather than get the vaccine.
Wow.
So that does not bode well. So I do think that there's, if their objective is to have everybody vaccinated, I think that they're
finding ways.
I
So-
wish it was a little more direct. I just wish I knew more. I
Yeah.
I don't like not knowing. I don't
Yeah.
like being out of control of
Yeah,
things that would
nobody, definitely nobody wants to be left hanging. That's for sure. And I guess I want to clarify something that I said earlier. First of all, I said that the data that I talked about, the cases for the military, that they were from November. It was actually the DoD civilian data that was from November. The service member data is actually as of January 12th, which was yesterday. So those 88 military deaths are current. And it does take us even through Omicron with the amount of cases. So there's still quite a bit of, I mean, those numbers are a lot lower than I would have expected, I think. One question I have, maybe before we shift gears on vaccination, is when they write the movie about you, kind of like Hacksaw Ridge, what do you think they could title it?
I'll go with a delightful office quote of "Somehow I manage."
There you go.
Well,
yeah. And
I know we do want to shift gears just
Yeah.
because I know that this entire podcast wasn't intended to be about the COVID vaccination. Jason, I've been trying to get your attention
Yeah.
because my monitor just turned off.
You got
I
nothing.
don't know
Okay.
what's going on. I don't know if you need to just move the mouse or something, or
Maybe
I don't know
see
what's
if I
going
can
on.
take care of that for you.
But while Jason's figuring that out, I had a question for you, GI, and Jason may be able to tune into this one as well. We really wanted to talk about what it looks like to be a Christian in the military. I mean, what is the culture like as a Christian right now? I know Jason's got a lot of a lot of experience on what it was like to be one back in the day, and I guess before I let this question go on, I'll give you some reasoning as to why I'm asking it too. GI, as you know, being my friend, we have another friend who is in the military. I think everybody listening to this podcast has probably had a friend or family member in the military. And the culture is typically pretty, and I'm going to use harsh words on purpose, the culture is typically pretty degenerate, not super conducive to a man of faith. At least that's what I have gained from the knowledge of what some of my friends have been through in the military. So I guess what's your perspective as somebody who has just recently enlisted, and then afterward we can get Jason's perspective as somebody who was enlisted back when Hector was a pup.
Yeah, that's a good question. And my perspective and experience is that people are okay with you being a Christian as long as you don't talk about it. And as long as you don't say anything controversial.
So
And
it's kind of like don't ask, don't tell.
The new version, yeah.
kind of. And this is speaking specifically to colleagues. This is not regarding leadership because I have never been in a position other than my exemption situation, where I had any opportunity to have a conversation involving religion with leadership, other than receiving briefings, I guess.
Sure.
But yeah, people, it's a younger generation, so there's an expectation that you're not going to rock the boat, and there's orders to that effect, and I do and have to obey those. And my experience, like I've mentioned, the training that I was in was longer than most training by a lot. And so the people that I was with, I grew to know pretty well. And anytime something would come up, I could tell when I was about to make them dislike what I was about to say. I was always aware
Sure.
of it. For example, like I remember somebody brought food in at one point, and I was like, that looks really good, but I actually don't eat pork. And they're immediately like, oh, why? And I was like, I don't think it's a salvation issue, but I just choose to, follow certain, old law and blah, blah, blah. And they look at you like you have a second head, it's,
Right. Whereas if you
and
were Muslim and you said, I don't eat pork, I don't think anybody would, really ask twice or think twice about it. But being a Christian that doesn't eat pork, from experience, just like people don't, they actively don't like it. They get like offended that you will not eat their bacon.
and I never even made it like a conversation. There was
Right.
no evangelizing. I personally, like I said, I don't think it's a salvation issue. I don't even think it's that big of. I wouldn't even call it an issue, really. It's just a thing that I do, and there was never like a conflict caused by it. But I could tell that by
Right. It was
having
just an
that
example.
stance, that I was abnormal is
Yeah.
how that comes off. And I mean, I know, like, if I said to somebody like, yeah, my wife and I just have a rule that we don't have any friends of the opposite sex. I know that people would be like, what the heck is wrong with you? Like, people would have a strong issue with it.
Yeah.
There's
I mean, it's exactly what happened when Mike Pence came out and said that he was following like the Billy Graham rules and stuff like that.
Yeah.
yeah, and so there's, I guess, to summarize and make it a little more clear, maybe it's not so much that people are ever told anything to that effect. It's more of just you understand what the expectations to say or not say are if you're a religious person. That's kind of how it's said. And like I said, there are orders to the effect that you can't say certain things in a professional context, like when you're on duty doing things. And I've always respected those, but there's a lot of other things that you can't say because of the social ramifications. So,
Yeah, that's a good word. I mean, I think for me, my perspective a long time ago now, before Hector or while Hector was a pup.
Yeah, when Hector was a
Yeah.
pup.
Was much different. Like, I mean, we kind of had just really a free for all. There was certainly, to Mike's point earlier, the culture of depravity. I was a sailor, and they were proud of that, right? I think I was just talking to somebody the other day about, these guys were like teaching me how to play spades one mid-watch when we were on duty, and they found it fun because they knew, the culture that I kind of grew up in and the environment and the Christian home and stuff of, bringing me up to speed of all the things that they did when they were in the Philippines. And I don't think really the story of the Philippines was as enjoyable to them as just watching this Christian kid squirm in his chair about, all the stuff. And, so I think we probably had a little bit more liberty of the things that we could say and do. It was kind of more old school military where, it really took a grievance, a pretty grave grievance, I think, in order for something to burble up of, any form of harassment or, sexual harassment or whatever else. So I think in some ways, I think the military's probably moved towards a little more professional environment, which I'm, not altogether unthankful about. But, I think, what I've seen and what we kind of want to take a look at maybe next is just, how, even starting with senior leadership, embracing some of these, quote unquote, for lack of a better word, I guess, woke ideologies, and how, not only are they embracing them, as it was talked about when I was still in, but I think that's becoming part of their marketing campaigns. So we're going to take a look at a quick recruitment video. Like when I was getting recruited, like I said, I joined the Navy, and it was let the journey begin, and so it was all about like, the places you can go, the things you can see, the man that you can become. It was those kind of core things of what it meant to be in the military. I remember growing up too, just the few, the proud, the Marine. Those commercials were just like, they were looking for a very certain type of person, one that was dedicated, one that was committed to country, one that had a love of country and a love of honor and integrity.
I thought you grew up around like the Uncle Sam era. Am I like a couple decades off? Or?
Yeah, not too far off. Like I said, we've already established Hector was just a pup. But,
he was just a pup, yeah.
But we're gonna play a new modern Army ad here, and then we'll circle back with our thoughts on that.
This is the story of a soldier who operates your nation's Patriot missile defense systems. It begins in California, with a little girl raised by two moms. Although I had a fairly typical childhood, took ballet, played violin, I also marched for equality. I like to think I've been defending freedom from an early age. When I was 6 years old, one of my moms had an accident that left her paralyzed. Doctors said she might never walk again. But she tapped into my family's pride to get back on her feet, eventually standing at the altar to marry my other mom. With such powerful role models, I finished high school at the top of my class, and then attended UC Davis, where I joined a sorority full of other strong women. But as graduation approached, I began feeling like I'd been handed so much in life, a sorority girl stereotype. Sure, I'd spent my life around inspiring women, but what had I really achieved on my own? One of my sorority sisters was studying abroad in Italy. Another was climbing Mount Everest. I needed my own adventures, my own challenge. And after meeting with an Army recruiter, I found it. A way to prove my inner strength and maybe shatter some stereotypes along the way. I'm U.S. Army Corporal Emma Malone Lord, and I answered my calling.
What calls you, Mike?
Dude,
man.
so I just have to say, first of all, my first impression was, okay, so they don't want white men in the Army anymore because they showed everything but a white man. I guess they have too much of them now. The second thing is, as soon as I saw the soldier's name, I immediately thought of my brother-in-law who is watching right now, whose daughter's name is Emma. That's my niece's name is Emma. So he texted me during that, and he was like, "Why does her name have to be Emma?" But man, that's the first time I've ever watched that, and I just have to laugh. I mean, I can't even believe that's real.
Yeah, and I mean, there's a handful of others. What are your thoughts, GI?
I'll make sure to leave pauses because I have a whole lot of thoughts about this video. All right, I'll kind of go in order of how I thought about this. If she went to UC Davis, why did she not commission as an officer? And does that mean that she didn't finish college? Which is fine if she didn't. I went to college and didn't finish. But if I went to college and didn't finish, I wouldn't be expected to be used as a poster boy for recruitment either. And if she tried to recruit, or if she tried to commission and wasn't able, what does that mean? We don't have more information, but I just thought that was super strange because she's a corporal. Yeah. Like I know somebody who tried to commission before enlisting, and there was a wait list, so they didn't. And that's like a fine reason, but it's just weird that it was mentioned. I thought that was odd, but maybe that's something that more, as someone now in the military, I'm more aware of than I would have been as a potential recruit.
Yeah, I never would have thought about that.
Well, and I think, you think UC Davis, I mean, it's a very liberal school as well, in a very liberal state. And so part of me has to wonder if the reason for mentioning it is because you're trying to get, some of these folks that maybe went to these liberal arts schools but haven't found satisfaction to look at the Army as they try and rebuild their woke ranks a little bit, and make intentional efforts to at least call out, those that may have extremist leanings, calling them out and saying there's no place for you. And again, like, I think some of us would probably agree that we don't want extremists in our military, but the problem is I don't think I necessarily trust the modern definition of what it means to be an extremist. If parents showing up at, PTC meetings are considered domestic terrorists or looked into as domestic terrorists, we've probably changed the meaning of extremist as well.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's easier for us to talk about it since we're not actively enlisted. So, I want to say a disclaimer that our thoughts are our own and do not reflect on our guest GI.
Yep.
As he, he'll speak for himself.
Yeah,
so.
exactly. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So I mean that's a modern woke advertisement trying to get folks in the Army. I just read this week that the Army is now offering $50,000 signing bonuses for those that are up to $50,000 right now as they're trying to fill their ranks and finding it difficult.
Yeah, that
And you
kind
wonder
of ties
why.
in. Yeah, that ties into one of the other things that I wanted to talk about is if you're wanting and needing to recruit and you only have so much time and money to try to recruit people, you can only make so much content to try to recruit people. It would be like it doesn't make sense to target such an extremely specific and small group, right? Like why it'd be like somebody who needs to hire a bunch of chefs for their restaurant. If they made this same ad, but it was a chef instead of a soldier, it would make no sense. Be like, why? What am I supposed to take away from this?
Yeah.
Like,
That the
I
Army
just
is
wanted,
virtuous and woke, or
like, I just
that the
wanted to apply to
restaurant.
be a chef.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah,
or-
I think there's a huge disconnect on like what the American people actually care about, because the people who want this like woke media, they're just the ones that are screaming the loudest.
yeah, that's absolutely true. And I think that that's what it boils down to, but that doesn't mean that I don't want to pick this apart and have words to say about it. Like,
Yeah,
why?
no, I hear
yeah.
you. Yeah.
And I think it's important, right? Because what we're trying to do with this is be critical thinkers, right? Like there's something in that. Now, to me, it did play to Mike and my emotions when we watched it, but they probably weren't the emotions they were attempting to trigger. But for a lot of people, it probably will trigger, certain emotions of, I'm so proud of you, and your two moms, what a great example of American life, and but to your point, is that how we I mean, even if those tickle your fancy, is that how we really measure what it means to be great, right? Like, this is a gal who said, in some ways she was always fighting for freedom because she was, in pride marches as a kid. Like, there's a difference, and anyone that's served any time in the military, especially those that have gone downrange to any extent, you're going to understand that, once you hit the battlefield, it doesn't really matter if you have two moms, two dads, or no mom or no dad. What matters is, am I equipped to do the job that I'm supposed to do out here?
Yeah, one thing that does matter is if you can carry 150 pounds on
Right.
your back.
For sure. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's another thing that stood out to me. So, and I agree with you. Like, what matters is your ability to do the job. But if you're going to target, like, if you're going to have a story like this, where you're kind of talking about a person's background, wouldn't you choose somebody more applicable to the norm? I think it would. If you're going to choose somebody who's not what we'd consider, I don't know, like a good Christian house, like a normal, like you had mom and a dad, and you had X amount of siblings. Like, if you're not going to choose that, then the easiest, most applicable one that would still be sympathetic, that is very common in the military, is to have a story with an absent father. There's a
Right.
ton
Yeah.
of people in
Yep.
the military with an absent father. If you wanted to attract more people, wouldn't you go for that?
Well, technically, if you have two moms, you have an absent father. So, I mean, they kind of killed two birds with one stone on that one.
Well, but and I think you bring up a great point, actually, GI, and I think that that's one that, even ties to loosely what we had already talked about with the vaccine mandate, and a lot of this really is that some of these decisions, if you were to ask a sergeant on the ground who he's most excited about, right? I don't think top 10 on his list is going to be someone that went to UC Davis or has two moms, right? Like, not to say that someone who fits into that category couldn't make a good soldier or airman or sailor, right? But that's not how we measure success in the military, right? Like, it's things like integrity, it's things like character, the things that a lot of the old recruitment videos used to be about, right? But now you have people in the top of the PR and for me, I know when I was serving in the military, the chief of naval operations, or the Secretary of the Navy was always a civilian, and I think a Secretary of the Army and Air Force, I believe, are I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm not going to speak for
Yeah, they are. They are.
But these are people that are brought in by a president, and they get to kind of set the tone, if you will, right? And so I'm thinking back to like just this last summer, right? As we're trying to suss through as a nation, the crippling effects of even 2 summers ago, right, where riots were on the streets and cities were burning down, right? And you have General Milley, who's weighing in saying basically, on the issue of critical race theory, a lot of us have to get much smarter on whatever the theory is. But I do think it's important actually for those of us in uniform to be open-minded and widely read. I want to understand white rage, and I'm white, end quote. And then just one more piece here. This is coming from a Newsweek article. 3 months later, the country learned that Milley had made a secret phone call to Chinese officials in the final days of Trump administration and defended Black Lives Matter during the summer's riots, and at one point reportedly telling Trump's senior advisor to shut the F up when he criticized the riots. That's General Milley, like, this is one of the highest ranking military officials in the United States of America, and the things that he's concerned with and the things that he's peddling on television and elsewhere, they're pretty alarming, at least for me, from a guy that came from a very different military time.
Yeah. And I wanted to say, just as kind of a personal anecdote, and I'll apologize, there's a neighbor's dog barking if you hear that, but I have one of my uncles who is an infantry veteran who, ended as a sergeant before he got out. He said that the guys that he wanted, and this is a very devout Christian man. He is always willing to talk about scripture. And he said that the people that he wanted to work with, he said the guys that I wanted were ones that were killers. And he didn't mean in like a criminal sense. He meant people that just had tenacity and, could do their job intensely and do it well, and that their concern was going to be for being excellent at what they did, which, regardless of how we feel about it, is being ready to take lives, hopefully for the right reasons. And I think that's a lot more important than what we saw in the video.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, I can also see the issue with advertising for killers, though, too. You know what I'm saying? That's by no means a justification for the abomination that we have seen that has come out of the Army. But I mean, I imagine recruiting is difficult in general, and man, I don't know. Maybe they've been seeing a drop in numbers, so they decided to change their strategy. But I don't think that any drop in numbers would be because the armed forces aren't woke enough. I think it's probably just because of a general distrust in the government. And that's kind of a question I have for both you guys. So I come from a place where, like, I went to school for something, right? And I don't think I should have gone to school for that thing. And I have a lot of people come to me and say, hey, my kid wants to go to school for the thing that you went to school for. What's your advice for him? And my advice is usually don't do it. So that's my testimony. Knowing what you guys know now, seeing what the government is doing, seeing the way that things are going, if somebody came up to either one of you guys and asked you, hey, I'm 17. I'm thinking about enlisting in the armed forces next year. What advice would you have for me? Like, what would you guys say?
You
Uh,
want to shoot at that one, GI, first?
sure, sure. So, my serious advice for right now, having the beliefs that I do, would be that you should wait to see what happens with exemptions. And if it's going to return to a situation where you can enlist and say, I need to have an exemption for this vaccine or all vaccines or whatever your convictions are, then for somebody who doesn't have a better logistical situation, like I did not when I enlisted, then I would say sure, but definitely wait. Um, because if, you know, morally you don't want to receive this vaccine for your religious beliefs, then I think you should wait and hopefully not have to. Don't know if I expect that to be the case, but that would be my advice. I'm also in like a really specialized field and got lucky, very, very lucky and blessed to be where I'm at. So my perspective is a little bit warped because I've been given a very good role. So if somebody who isn't going to be able to go to college, but maybe somebody who's kind of a air quotes wasted potential kind of kid like I was, who was relatively intelligent but didn't do well at school, I think those type of people are actually perfect for where I'm at. So I
Sure.
would definitely recommend this if they're able to do it without having to compromise their moral beliefs. If that doesn't change, and just, or if somebody is just doing it because they have nothing better to do, I would say probably not.
Yeah, and I guess I would answer it fairly similarly. I had a very positive experience with the military. I think for me, I was coming right out of high school. Definitely was not interested in going to college. Knew that if I did, I would probably be causing trouble and wasting money. And so I jumped at the opportunity to join the military, and I'm grateful that I did. It actually set me up for life in the field that I'm currently in. All the training that I received when I was in the military. So, but I would also say, like, kind of to GI's point, like, don't bet the farm on it. You know what I mean? Like, don't make it the only option that you can have, because to be honest, I would not be surprised that certain convictions, even within the military, become very much frowned upon. And to GI's point, right? Like, for me personally, like, I grew up in the military under Don't Ask, Don't Tell, right? So it wasn't okay for people to be out and open serving in the military. They could be gay, and I certainly knew those that were in that were gay, so they were telling. But maybe
Well, you were in the Navy, so it's a little
yeah, I mean that's telling in and of itself, I think. But I guess the point is it is a different military, but at the same point, right? Like, I'm in corporate America, and those same problems exist there, right? So the things that I see in the military, I think in some ways, like, it's just catching up to some of the corporate culture that we've seen in America for a long time. The problem is, I don't think those things make us more operationally ready. I think, in fact, they're a distraction from what the war machine actually is intended to be for, right? Like one of the things that's made American military great is that we really have had, in the majority of my adult life, peace through superior firepower, right? And other countries knowing that American military is ready and willing and able. And those are some of the questions I have, is as we continue to trek down this path where we're more interested in worldview than we are operational readiness, are we really ready to win a war? And I mean, that's from a guy who, I'm not pro-war. I'd prefer just to threaten someone with a big stick than actually have to use it. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I think those are very insightful answers. Probably better answers than I myself would have given in your current spots. I appreciate the amount of gratitude you guys have towards the opportunities that you've been given, and I think that that's something I could probably learn from as well. Usually here on this podcast, we spend a lot more time talking about gospel related things. I'm trying to figure out a way to bring this conversation into a more gospel centered place, but I'm like drawing blanks right now.
Well, a couple questions that I have, and maybe we could just do it from a Q&A standpoint, right? I'd love to know, GI, if you found opportunities with your other military members. One thing that I really cherished about my time in the Navy is that, as God opened doors of friendship, and the camaraderie is wonderful. At least it was for me when I was in the service. And I was married too. And I think yourself being an older guy, you're probably going to be able to have opportunities where you sort of become almost a de facto father, big brother for a lot of folks. I'm just wondering if you've had any opportunities really to share your faith, share the gospel with some others that maybe, to your point earlier, are kind of young, first time away from mom and dad and trying to navigate this new world, which seems probably overwhelmingly big to some younger guys.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny that you mentioned that too, because in basic training, my nickname I was given was Father. So both because of my age and because of my religious convictions.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, in basic training, definitely. Basic training was a lot more free because everybody is so freaked out and stressed out, and there was nothing off limits at basic training. I think that was a lot closer to the experience that you described as a whole. Your experience was similar to mine at basic training. And
just, you're talking the beat downs from the drill instructor and stuff.
Yeah, and just like people being, I don't know, just the cultural differences being something that people were interested in, and maybe that expressed itself in poor ways, like you were talking about with spades or whatever. But so yeah, I had the opportunity to witness, pointedly, deliberately, and for an extended length of time to a couple people at basic training. Since then, I mean, not so much. In some of my training, some of the things that I had to do were to write papers, and some of them would be on religious topics, but that wasn't the point was the writing ability. The point wasn't the whether or not anybody agreed or disagreed exactly with my beliefs. But like I wrote about, coincidentally, I wrote a paper about why I morally disagree with gene therapy, which was pretty pointed. And also just the way that different cultural, like my evaluation of different cultural beliefs kind of, and how they related to my own in the context, it was kind of an area studies sort of thing. So those, I mean, but those only go to the people that are reading those papers in my training. And there were definitely situations where religion was talked about in kind of broad terms, but it's just not set up in such a way, at least in the training that I received. You're all in a group setting. It's not so much like that I even have an opportunity to try to overtly, witness to somebody. And because of the time management here, there really wasn't time outside of that either. I did find other Christians, and had spent some time outside of training with them, but just, I guess, the logistical situation in my actual training after basic training kind of just precluded that from being a realistic option.
Yeah, no, I get that. Any young airmen trying to get you to buy them beer?
No, not really.
Good
I
job,
mean,
Father.
I mean, they might have just known that I would say no.
They knew better.
They might have. I mean, I think I actually told somebody that, because there was somebody that I knew was going to be going to the follow-on training with me, and I knew that he was younger, and we got along well. We're still friends, and I like, half jokingly, I told him like, hey, don't don't ask me to buy you alcohol or cigarettes or anything. I'm not going to do it. So, but I had never really thought about that. So that probably then gets around like, oh, don't bother asking him.
He's
But
not your guy.
yeah, and I mean the field that I'm in is a lot more specialized and nerdy than the norm. I'm very much not infantry or anything combat facing. So the people here, I think on the whole, are less of the military stereotype of like
Sure.
when you mentioned the degeneracy that in some other
Yeah.
aspects. There's definitely still a lot of, things that as a Christian I strongly disagree with, especially being that it's younger people in the modern era. But it was less so in the stereotype of, what you would think about maybe a a grungy soldier or marine going to a foreign country and doing.
Gotcha.
Yeah, I got you. I hear you loud and clear there. Which is nice. That's
Yeah.
good for you. I mean, as a man of convictions, right?
I
To
think
not
so.
be, deep in the heart of like temptation like that. So,
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. I think as I think about even my own son potentially walking into the Navy, I'm just like, oh man, I can't imagine him sitting through some of those conversations that I had to with some of my superiors. It was all in good fun, but he struggles with anxiety, so he'd be calling us on every break, probably trying to tell on himself as far as what he had to listen to.
Yeah.
So
It was very interesting to see the difference. There were a couple of other older people in my group when I was going through basic training, and we were all kind of just like, guys, this is, an endurance test.
yes,
Like none of
exactly.
this, they
It's
don't.
gonna matter after 10 weeks.
Yeah. And but the younger people would be freaking out. I mean,
Yeah.
we lost a couple of people, like people who would have to go, they'd go talk to the chaplain and disappear. And this is no shade thrown on them, but it was so bizarre as somebody who joined later in life being like, guys, none of this matters, and I'm in worse shape than all of you.
Yeah.
Like, like
Yeah.
just get through it. But
Well,
yeah, so
yeah. Oh, go ahead.
to kind of tie back into what Mike mentioned before, though, is how the gospel relates to this more directly. I told my wife the other day, and I think I told maybe Mike as well. I said, if we get to the point where they deny the exemption and then they deny the appeal, I know that they're going to ask me. They're going to say again, like, well, you could just get it. You can still just get it. And I already know that I'm just going to say, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. And that's going to be it.
Amen. Well, and we're certainly grateful for your boldness. I think obviously aware of your situation and caring for you and your family a great deal. You are in our thoughts and our prayers. And, I think, to be honest, to your point, I just saw something on one of the socials today where a daughter was, tying her dad's tie, and she said, Dad, what were you doing when all of my freedoms were being taken away? And he said, I was too busy wearing a mask and afraid to say anything controversial. And I'm thankful for men and women of conviction that are willing to stand on it, to trust in God for his provision. He's faithful. That doesn't mean that things are always going to go the way that we expect them to, or even hope that they would. But what it does mean is that he is going to prevail in the end, that he will be glorified in our convictions, and that and that we will be blessed as well. So God is most glorified in us when we are most satisfied in him. And so even when things are on the line, it speaks a great deal of our faith to those who are watching when we're willing to lay those things down to say yes to Jesus. So I'm proud of you.
Thank you. And I'll say explicitly too, Mike, some of the conversations that we've had are some of the things that have given me the courage to do what I'm doing now. So, where two or three are gathered, as they say.
yeah. Yeah, no, and I appreciate that encouragement as well. And to that, I'd have to say all that inspiration comes from being in the Word. I mean, especially reading Paul's letters to the early churches, how can you not feel emboldened as a man to speak boldly, to speak clearly, and to, like you said, not be ashamed of the gospel? Yep. Paul says that we need to be like him as he is in Christ. we have to be in Christ, right? And in order to be in Christ, we cannot be ashamed of the gospel. We have to speak the truth. We have to speak the truth without being embarrassed of it. And we have to let it speak for itself, knowing that we likely will be hated on behalf of Christ, knowing that the world hated Christ first, right? So in all of that, and GI, I know you and I have had a lot of conversations and back and forth about like just making sure we spend more time in the Word, because when we aren't spending time in the Word, that's when we start to feel worthless as men. That's when we start to retreat back into our shells, and we start to retreat away from societal pressures, and then that's when we let the secular and human world start to make decisions for us, and before we know it, we're in a place where we never wanted to be in the first place because we didn't speak up. So we need to stay in the Word and allow that Word to give us the confidence that, by the way, is not of our flesh,
right,
but is a confidence of the Holy Spirit that's in us.
Absolutely, brother.
Yeah, and I think that's a great word. And don't, if you're listening right now, and you have a daughter named Emma, no, just kidding. If you're listening right now, don't think that this doesn't also apply to you. Maybe you're not a military person with no, you don't have military background, but we all get to carry these convictions into our lives, and we're supposed to, right? The stakes may be different, the situations and the circumstances may be as well, but God is making his appeal to the world through us. And so as we submit to Christ and walk in obedience, just remember that the highest flag that we get to wave is not the American flag. The highest honor that we carry is not our military rank and file, but the highest honor that we carry is we are ambassadors for Jesus Christ, and there is a perishing world out there. And so we have to, as we always say, week in and week out, we have to do our part to ensure that they're hearing the truth. And sometimes that's going to come at cost to us, and that's okay, right? Because our crowns are in heaven, right? And for those brave men and women who have put it on the line and it's cost them something, we are grateful for you. For those brave men and women who have put it on the line, and God has provided an open door for you to stay in the positions that you're in. Walk faithfully in them. The game's not over. It wasn't just about victory with a religious exemption. What are you going to do with that? Now your company, knows that you are a religious person. They've given you the freedom to talk about your religion and make it known. So do it, honor Jesus.
And I've gone down that road with at least one employee because of that, where, he's remote on the other side of the country, and I jumped right into witnessing to him, and I literally used that argument. I said, well, since HR has made it appropriate to talk to one another about our religions, and then I just kind of spilled it on him, and it turned into a really, really good conversation where this was an older gentleman that had kind of fallen away from the faith a little bit, and just opening a crack in the door and letting the light of the Holy Spirit flood his life. That was enough for him to feel convicted enough to go to church on Christmas.
That's cool.
Where he wasn't going to before. So it's just those little things, right?
Use them. God has given this as an open door. So, GI, we'd love to give you the last word here. Any final thoughts from you?
Just that, I'm thankful to the supportive colleagues that I've had, and to anybody that might be, private or military, who's maybe waiting to hear back or fighting for a religious exemption. Continue and exhaust every legal option. And you to be a good witness, don't compromise your convictions because you're worried about money. That is contrary to what I believe and I have taken away from the gospel.
Amen. All right, Mike, well, do you want to give us a shout out? Do you want me to do it?
No, I'll give us the shout out. So we said it earlier, and we say it multiple times because we mean it. And it is the truth. And there is a perishing world out there, pilgrims. So do your part to ensure that they are hearing the truth. God bless you, and stay pugnacious.